She stood on the raised plank as if the wind and the county had nothing to do with the line of her jaw. Dawn was thin, the sky a sheet of bruised linen, and the crowd below made a ring like a slow-moving tide. Ropes hung ready. Chief Nantan's voice was a dry bell. The law said she had refused a claim and must be shamed so the grievance could be named and closed. The rope bit at her wrists. It bit, and she felt it like a winter word. Hard, necessary, and not hers. Ayana kept her hands loose. She looked over the heads of them all rather than down at the men who had gathered to watch something they thought would be simple to finish. Her mind went elsewhere in brief, bright threads. The braid at the back of her neck, the way the comb had slid from between its plaits when a hand, some hand in the street, had reached to steady her days before. That comb, small and toothless with use, became a talisman in the hollow of her hand. She turned it like a worrystone and let the crowd's murmurs fall into the spaces between the teeth. They had brought her here for saying no. Saying no had cost her a lifetime's small thoughtfulness, the neighbor's gossip, the shopkeeper's smirk, the minister's lowered eyes. But what this ritual intended was more cruel, to make refusal into spectacle so that the town might feel its justice done. Ayana had not come to be broken. She had come to be understood. She had come to prove, with a calmness that did not ask for pity, that a woman could hold a refusal like a thing as steady as a knife. Then the rider arrived. He rode as if he had been born to the small troubles of a saddle. Correct hands, no flourish, no trumpet. His horse was grayed at the muzzle, the hide of its flank shivering with a memory of wind. He dismounted without a show and stood a little apart, the sun catching the lines of his face like a map. He carried a coat slung over his arm, leather rubbed to a soft black. He had the kind of hands that knew rope and knife in the same cold certainty. When he spoke, his voice had the low grain of someone who had learned to wait for what he wanted. "I'll take her," he said. The phrase sounded like a small, impossible thing. There was a rustle among the watchers. Chief Nantan's mouth tightened. The law, in its old, brittle way, allowed exchange. Name for name, life for life, claim transacted. It was barter pretending to be justice. The rider invoked it without ceremony. He did not clap his hand upon Ayana's shoulder or announce triumph. He merely signed, an old man on the platform, a faint motion, and the town felt its chains shift. Ayana regarded him. Her eyes, which had not left the town's faces, now traveled the rider's figure in the way a surveyor reads a map. Measure, notch, read. His cheek bore a pale scar that tracked from ear toward jaw like a dry riverbed. His knuckles were weathered, his hair not all the same color it might someday have been. He was not young, and he did not claim the stage. There was a name spoken, quiet and precise. Koya. It was a name he held as something he had been given and taken, not a thing he offered like a coin. He had waited, they would say. 20 years. For what? This? For her? The town wondered in the little ways towns do, where curiosity and judgment brew the same coffee. The fact of the number frosted the faces around them, made some softer and some harder. Ayana heard it, not as proof, but as a detail. An ache translated into time, which could mean many things. He removed the rope from her wrists with a care that was neither eager nor possessive. His fingers moved like a craftsman untying a knot in leather. The motion was a courtesy, not a claim. He gave her his coat without commentary. The coat was heavy with a scent she would learn to name: smoke, earth, the faint copper of old rain. He kept his distance as they stepped down. The exchange had saved her life, and already the law would try to say that saved life belonged to its books. Stay with Ayana. Her choice will not be the one they expect. They left the platform with the town's whispers following like a train of paper flags. The first miles were made of small things, the road chewed at the horizon, a gray ribbon threaded with stones. Koya walked beside his horse, letting Ayana ride, his silence folded around them like a second coat. When the wind gnawed at their faces and pushed dust under their lids, he tilted the brim of his hat and opened a canteen. He offered it without ceremony. She took it because thirst is an honest law. Night came with a knife edge. They camped beside a dry gully where the land dropped and the stars thinned. Koya's fire was practical, hot for a short time, fed by small, disciplined strikes. He mended a bit of leather, his fingers moving with a machinist's calm. He held a needle as if it were a compass. Ayana watched him, the lines of his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened when he had to draw the thread. At some point he produced the comb, Ayana's comb, from the fold of his coat, as if the small thing had been waiting there like a proof. He had found it in the grass when he cut through earlier. He did not make of this discovery a grand tale. He handed it back with both humility and the steady insistence of a man who considered small acts their own kind of fidelity. "You could have kept it," she said. "I would have put it by," Koya answered, and the words were simple and honest. He had waited, but he did not assume that waiting bought him wonder. He had preserved a trifle because preserving trinkets is one way to keep the world whole when everything else is rough. Travel teaches intimacy the way a slow stitch teaches fabric. Trust did not arrive as a trumpet but as a ledger of debts and credits in the quiet. Water shared, a bandage pressed, a quiet foot when coyotes made their night music. Ayana kept her distance as if distance were the only defense that would guarantee an intact self. But she watched him work. The man had calluses that told stories of rope and iron. He had a gait made of long steps and pauses, as if he carried both the habit of marching and the habit of standing still for long counts of time. They crossed the kinds of towns that have no patience for people who aren't fast to make themselves respectable. A shopkeeper spat into the road where Ayana's horse had passed. A saloon door banged shut as if to intercept them with its own prejudice. Men in vests lowered their cups and watched. Sometimes a barbed remark would be made. Koya did not rise to challenge. He answered when answer was needed with the smallest possible fact. Once a man called out to ask what badge had given him the right to trade for a woman's life. Koya's reply was the kind of quiet that could work like a hinge. "This is not a prize," he said. "It is a man keeping what he promised to keep." People judged him in the small ways anyone does when a stranger is a mirror for their own conscience. Ayana felt the weight of those glances as if they were stones inside the belly of a bag. She found herself measuring how much of herself she wanted to put into each hand. The comb returned to her hair, back where it belonged. The action was not performative so much as necessary. The storm came without a recorded warning. Sky folded itself into a mass of iron, and rain fell like an accusation. The creek that had been a low, considerate thing began to swell, the water making new rules and swallowing the bones of the road. Horses, usually sure of a path, balked at the change. A young mare, thin, head high, recently rid of a foal's mothering habit, slid on the slick bank and tipped toward the current like a person pushed by a wary god. Ayana and Koya moved before they thought of it as a test. The mare's halter had been snagged. Koya had a rope and a plan more felt than stated. He leaned his weight against the animal's flank, and Ayana reached past the slick fur with hands that were patient and sure. The water took a toe, then a hoof. It wanted to claim the animal as if the creek itself had a jealous heart. They hauled in the way a pair of workers haul in a harvest, coordinated, breath-timed, invested. Koya found purchase for his boots against the sod, his legs folding like a hinge. Ayana braced and turned her face into the rain so she couldn't see the other's strain. When the mare finally came free, she shuddered and stamped and gave a sound that was close to sobbing. Water slapped their clothing, made the world a blurred page, but inside the blur there were small things. Koya's hand, a sure hold on the rope, Ayana's fingers steady on the halter. They brought the animal away from the edge, and in the mud and the stench of fear, something shifted. After, they sat with their backs to the wind, shirts clinging to shoulders, and Koya took a cloth and pressed at the mare's flank with an attention that had the decency of prayer made in work. Ayana watched the set of his mouth and heard grief in it. Not theatrical mourning, but a long, gathered sorrow someone had learned to keep on the inside. The scar along his jaw seemed to tighten when he smiled, small and private. 2 winters in a row, he said, as if completing a passage already started. I was not there for one. I made sure I would be for this one. Ayana did not ask the obvious question. Did he mean her? The question hovered like a star that was too far to reach. Instead, she said softly, You came back often enough to learn the land's moods. He looked at her then, with the narrow, steady look of a man who had weighed his words against the cost of speaking. I was gone 20 years, he said. Out there, he gestured at the horizon that swallowed soldiers and traitors and the fortunes of men. The gesture was both specific and unlocated. I promised I would come when the winds changed. Signifiers of his absence gathered in the corners of their days. There were letters, crinkled and faded, with lines that stopped short. There was a leather strap knotted and re-knotted with the initials A over K, initials that had been threaded into time more as memory than ownership. There was a gait that refused to hurry toward anything but the slow business of return. But Ayana saw, as any person with eyes sees, that waiting had costs beyond the sentimental. Friends died, villages changed, the quick-faced child who would have grown might never be met. Waiting had made him older, more careful. It had cut away some eagerness that she might have once expected to see. They did not talk at length about the 20 years. The only thing that mattered was the present, because present was what allowed choice. Still, the village below them would pin a story onto any fact like a paper bird to a wire. Men in the tavern would say he had waited like a knight waiting for a maiden. Others would suggest penance. Older women would strew the narrative with pity. Ayana took these things in as she took the weather. They existed, but need not alter the shape of her. Then the messenger arrived. He came not as a man bearing malice, but as a representative of a social machine that moved with old, grinding certainties. He came in a saddle that smelled of city smoke and the thin paper of commands. He bore the edge of law and the dull hope of remedy. His words were the kind of language that took things back to tidy boxes. There is a remedy, he said to Ayana and Koya both. Return with the claim's bearer, and the offense is healed. You may consent, and if you do, the community will accept reconciliation. It is the way. The messenger's voice had the confident tone of someone reminding them of rules people had consented to a long time ago, and that the town would prefer never to inspect too closely. Ayana listened to the sentence like a recorded coin. It had weight, but it was not persuasive to her. The remedy offered was the old machinery of closure, consent under social pressure, the sort of thing that promises to smooth surfaces by forcing adherence. Koya's fingers tightened on his coat as if he were holding himself away from the temptation to take charge. He looked at Ayana and then at the messenger in a way that asked the question he should not ask for her. What would you have done? But he did not answer for her. That would have been to repeat the town's cruelty in a new register. Council will ask you to return, the messenger continued, as if the choice were merely procedural. This will heal the grievance. Ayana felt the rope's memory at her wrists like a line across her skin. Healing with a return would be another kind of binding. She thought of Chief Nantan's dry bell. She thought of the plank and the crowd's legs. Consenting would mean stepping back into the script that had written her refusal as transgression. She tasted the town's peace and saw how it smelled of compromise and measured humiliation. She would not let them define the limits of her life by the way they apologized when it suited them. Koya met her eyes then. The look he gave her was a small, immense thing. "I cannot," he began, the words cutting through the messenger's paper certainty. He stopped, and then he spoke with the slow care of someone named for things that matter. "I cannot give you to them as if you were a finished thing," he said. "I cannot say your life belongs to the remedy. If you choose to return, if you say yes because you want to, then I will ride with you. If you say no, then I will stand with you here, but I will not decide for you." Those words landed like a stone dropped into a pond. The messenger, trained to see compliance, found his script faltering. The town would like the elegancy of law. Koya offered instead the rawness of respect. It was not a heroic line, but it was rarer. Ayana considered the answer with the slow arithmetic of someone who keeps accounts. She thought of what it meant to say yes inside a crowd that had watched her shamed. She thought of what it meant to say no and live with the knowledge that a life of quiet might still be interrupted by prejudice. Choosing was not a clean thing. It was a selection among messy goods. At dawn, they climbed a ridge that overlooked the valley where the town slept like a thing that had been made of old habits. The sky was pale as a scalp. The wind cut the ridge and carried the smell of rain and brackish grass. Koya set his coat upon a rock and made no move to reach for her. The mule stood with its head bowed. There was between them an hour that felt like a drawing breath. Ayana pulled her braid free and fingers worked at the comb. She put the comb in her mouth as a child might taste the iron of a coin. Habit, balm, anchor. The comb had become a language between them. Its small teeth could measure moments. She looked at Koya and then at the town below, where the roofline sat like someone's hand pressed flat. She spoke then in a voice that let the town hear and yet was not made to please it. "I will not go back to be smoothed into what they imagine," she said. "I will not go because they ask it of me to make them feel right. If I return, it will be because I wish it, because I can choose the terms, and because the choice is mine." Her chin lifted. The rope's memory fell away with the clarity of that line. She did not need to call the men cowards. She did not need to show the town its shame. Her refusal was its own claim. It was a boundary and a gift. She would not be given as recompense for a wrong. Koya stepped forward as if answering an ancient, private summons. He extended his hand in a gesture that meant neither ownership nor demand, but rather partnership. "Stay," he said, and the single syllable was less a plea than a proposition. "What kind of staying?" she asked. She wanted to hear the shape of the life he proposed, as if she could judge its architecture. "A life where we wake and mend and do the hard, honest work," he said. "A life where I ask before I assume. A life where the rope never becomes the only law we know." Ayana considered him. She thought of the 20 years and what they had taught him. Waiting had cut away a certain theatricality and left in its place a steadiness that did not claim her. She thought of the mare pulled from the creek and the hands that had worked in the rain. "I will not be your reward," she said plainly. "You would not be," Koya replied. "You would be the one with whom I work and eat and sleep and share the quiet days. If you say yes, it is because you want that with me." She paused. The wind made the words between them thin. There was not a drama in the moment so much as a clarity. She saw the future as a set of actions rather than a poem. There would be mornings that were small and uncertain. There would be nights when the town's rumor scraped at windows. There would be children, perhaps, or not, and in any case, the choice would not be made for her. "I will stay," she said at last. The sentence was not fierce but exact, like a clock's tick. "Not because you waited, for waiting is no warrant, but because I think this is a life I could keep. I will stay because you have shown me the habit of return and the habit of asking." They clasped hands, but their hands were used to tools and rope and the work that needs two people to be done right. It was neither a coronation nor a surrender. It was a covenant made of small promises. Word reached the town slow as faith. Chief Nantan, who had once pronounced the law like a man reciting a contract, had no immediate response that would fit this simple, defiant motion. The messenger's return was quiet. People muttered and then found new small amusements in the days. Some called her foolish or brave or other names that had nothing to do with the truth of her life. They did not spend their life proving the town wrong. They tended it in ordinary ways. The narrative shows its resolution in the economy of care. Koya mending a saddle while she held the leather taut. Ayana setting aside a bowl of stew and smoothing a child's hair. Both of them waking before the sun to check the horse's hooves, to fold the ropes, to repair the fence that keeps winter's things from coming in. The comb, which had been a talisman and an exigency, found its permanent thrum as a small object tucked into the pocket of Koya's coat. Once, when he bent to saddle a colt, she found the comb and slipped it into her hair as if putting back a map. It was no longer an amulet, but a thing that had belonged and now remained. The scar on his cheek finally softened as his brow relaxed in the light of a kitchen fire. The leather strap with the initials grew more worn. Sometimes Ayana would run a thumb along the knot and think of the 2 decades that had reshaped a man into someone careful enough to ask. Prejudice, as it always does, did not vanish, but its edges dulled. The shopkeeper stopped spitting at the thoroughfare and instead repaired a hinge for Koya one afternoon when the rain had sanded down the town. Children began to come by with questions and wary admiration. Life, which had once been a ledger of harms, became a list of small domestic accounts. Who boiled the kettle, who sewed the rags, who fixed the harness. There was no miraculous erasure of history. The platform and the ropes kept their place in memory like a place at the kitchen table that nobody sits at anymore. There were nights when Ayana woke and felt the old fear as if it were a breath in her throat. Koya would wake too and make tea and offer it to her without comment, as if some tasks simply need doing to disarm the old harms. They spoke to one another in the work language of living. Tighten the latigo, feed the mare, watch the northwest for storms. These were small pronouncements, but they enfolded the deeper things. If the 20 years had been in part a promise, something Koya had made to an absence, a vow to return when the winds turned, then the time had carved him out into a shape fit for the companionship he had grafted for himself rather than a possession he might have assumed. He had learned in absence that waiting is a dangerous form of worship. It can calcify into claim. He corrected for that with the smallest acts. He asked. He waited for an answer. He accepted silence as an answer. His waiting became a lesson in how not to overreach. Ayana's practice of refusal remained a living thing. She taught it by doing rather than sermonizing, by putting the comb back in her hair when she liked, by choosing who to shelter and who to let walk in the wind. In time, the town's narrative softened into a story of 2 people who had chosen a life by labor and courtesy, which is a kind of love sturdy enough to outlast curiosity. In the late afternoons, when the light turned thin and the horses stamped, Koya would sit with a cup in his hands and look at her the way someone looks at a horizon they have not yet charted. His scar, the strap, the letters, these were the material of his history. He kept them like talismans that reminded him of what he'd learned. That return alone does not redeem, that the cost of waiting is a ledger of loss that must be acknowledged, not used as currency. There was a moment, months later, when a stranger rode up carrying a rumor about a place far to the west. He spoke of camps and the many ways people leave each other, and as he spoke, Ayana noticed the way Koya listened without hunger. It was then she understood the deepest lesson of his waiting. It had given him the habit of holding what he loved lightly enough that if it chose to leave, it would be free to do so, and heavy enough that he would try, for the sake of what it meant to him, to return. Their life did not become a storybook. There were winters when the roof leaked and summers when crops failed. There were petty squabbles and the occasional night of sharp words, but under all of that ran a quieter thing, a mutual tending that did not assume a victor in their love. They kept accounts in action, not in proclamations. They mended rope until the fibers of it learned to trust hands that had learned their pattern. Years, which had brought Koya a hard patience, softened him in ways he did not display easily. He learned to braid hair without fuss. He left the comb where Ayana could reach it. She learned to accept a hand offered without measuring its motives. Together, they built a small room in which the shadow of the platform grew thin with use. On an evening when the light was such that the dust in the air looked like slow fire, Ayana sat by the hearth and ran the comb through her braid. Koya stood in the doorway, a silhouette with the horse's scent woven into his clothes. He had a small, neat smile that did not pretend their world had no edges. He had learned to be present, to own his scar not as currency but as a map of his life. They held a life that honored refusal and honored return. The 20 years of his absence were not a talisman to force her choice, but a fact among many, a wound he carried and tended, not a justification. She had chosen to stay, not because the man had waited, but because the man had, in waiting, become someone who asked rather than assumed. If anyone in the town told the story afterward, they told it as a curiosity. A rider who had waited like a stone waiting for a river to change course. The truth was softer. He had waited and learned. She had refused and remained. Together they built a life with the economy of small mercies that a platform could never give them. If you have loved this story and wish to hear more like it, subscribe for the quiet tales that linger after the town has gone to bed.